Here I'm going to use a number line to find the product of 4 and 3. So to do 4 times 3, it's helpful to think of 4 times 3 as you are making 4 copies of 3. So I'm going to start at 0, and since I'm to make 4 copies of 3, I'm going to represent the number 3 by starting at 0 and jumping over to the number 3. Doing so means that you could almost even ignore the numbers in between. In fact, another copy of 3 would have me ignoring these numbers, and so on and so forth. So when I go to make my second copy of 3, that would have me moving another 3 units. This would be my third copy of 3, and then this would be my fourth copy of 3, telling me that if I had 4 copies of 3, this would result in 12. This means that 4 times 3 is 12. Now I'm going to do a similar example using the number line to find the product of 4 and negative 3. So to do 4 times negative 3, it may be helpful to think of 4 times negative 3 as you are making 4 copies of this number, so you would have 4 copies of negative 3. So starting at 0, you could represent the number negative 3 by moving 3 units, 1, 2, 3, in the negative direction, bypassing all the numbers in between. In fact, since we're moving by multiples of 3, you could ignore the numbers in between. When I make my second copy of negative 3, I will be skipping over these numbers, and this continues on. So if you were to count by 3's in the negative direction, it would go negative 3, negative 6, negative 9, negative 12, etc. So continuing on, this was my first copy of negative 3. Moving 3 units in the negative direction, I would get my second copy of negative 3. This would be my third copy of negative 3. And finally, my fourth copy of negative 3 would have me stopping at negative 12, meaning that 4 multiplied by negative 3 is equal to negative 12. So if you had to write a math equation, this would be the equation. Finally, I'd like to do a problem where both factors of the product would be negative. So my first number is negative and my second number is negative. I need to find the product of negative 4 and negative 3, or if you want, I need to find negative 4 times negative 3. It would be helpful to notice that the last example I did was 4 times negative 3, for which I argued could be thought of as you have 4 copies of negative 3. So what we want is, instead of 4 copies of negative 3, we want the opposite of 4 times negative 3. So let me put the word opposite here. So 4 times negative 3 is 4 copies of negative 3, and then this sign here says that we want the opposite of that. So let me start by doing 4 copies of negative 3. Like before, you could start at 0, and 1 copy of negative 3 would have you moving 3 units in the negative direction because it's negative 3. By moving 3 units, it's as if you could ignore the numbers in between. This isn't necessary, but it would represent what you would get if you were counting by 3's in the negative direction. You would get negative 3, negative 6, negative 9, so you wouldn't need these, then negative 12, then from negative 12 you'd move to negative 15 if you needed to go that far. But since I'm doing 4 copies of negative 3, this would be my first copy, my second copy, 3 copies of negative 3, and this would be 4 copies of negative 3. Now to represent the opposite of that, you can do 4 copies of 3, but instead of the negative direction, the positive direction. That could look like this: 1, 2, 3, 4. And that would be 4 copies of 3 in the positive direction rather than the negative, and you'd end at 12. Or a faster way perhaps is to draw a reflection line, and I will reflect the number negative 12 about the reflection line. So rather than being 12 units to the left of 0 at negative 12, we could reflect that number over to 12 units to the right of 0, meaning the positive direction, which would leave us at the number 12. So the opposite of 4 copies of negative 3, or if you want negative 4 times negative 3, you could write the answer as an equation by saying negative 4 times negative 3 is equal to 12. If you're doing this problem in Math AS and there's a separate question to write a math equation, then this is what you'd want to write.